Welcome to the coolest class you never got to take. Where else do you get to think about how important TV is in your life? How important it is in society? It's right here in your ears. You, me, and in this season, we're joined by some really smart guests. You'll learn an awful lot about how changes to cable TV led to the explosion of programming capacity, and we saw more women, and how original and recycled content filled that time. Please share this episode, recommend us to friends and family, press play for someone who hasn't quite nailed that technology thing. Thanks for listening. Herstorians, welcome back to this next lesson about television for women, television about women, and how we got to where we are today. This episode picks up on a chat with the super smart Dr. Amanda Lutz. While serving as a distinguished professor at fine universities throughout her career, Lotz has written books. She currently co-hosts a podcast called Media Business Matters, which I really encourage you to go ahead and grab a listen to. And she tracks the entertainment business closely so that she's the smart person on her podcast, in the classroom, when she's writing her next book. She's just inspiring. And most importantly, she was generous with her time in speaking with us to helping us get this lesson. So we're going to get right into this. No chit-chat with Dr. Lotz. She is this methodical woman, and she's tremendous in the way that she explains this big shift that took place decades ago and makes a very complicated process totally understandable. Then there was this thing called cable television, which really has changed so much and brings us to where we are today. And this is, again, some of Dr. Lotz's the depth of her knowledge of cable is what makes her the best. I can't think of a better, more qualified guest for Advanced TV Herstory to have talk about the original channels of cable TV and how there was this recognition of the female demographic and how cable responded to that. So however you want to tell the story of how cable brought us television for women.
Well, it's the story of cable in the U.S. It's a long story. And cable actually appears very early on simply just to help households that are not in places that can receive over-the-air signals receive channels. But for the first 20 or so years, there are rules in place that prevent cable service from doing anything other than just passing along those broadcast networks. So cable really starts to get interesting and starts to become something else in the mid-70s, when for the first time the regulators changed their mind again and allow channels that are strictly on cable to be formed. And it's a slow uptake over the course of the 70s and into the 1980s. But by the late 1980s, roughly half of U.S. homes have cable, which is a pretty big number. And it's at that point that we really start to see a launch of many original channels. And so at that point, Lifetime is on the air and it's trying to figure out really what its strategy is. It starts as a merger between a channel that was called Daytime and the Cable Health Channel. And I think what happened, it's easy to look back and see how obvious the strategy of targeting, a specific audience might be, but none of that was obvious in the moment because television had always been about trying to attract the broadest audience. And so saying that you were something specific, like television for women, that's a pretty bold statement about who should be watching and who shouldn't. And so to sort of say goodbye potentially to half of your audience, that was a bold move. And so in the early 1990s, though, Lifetime began to announce itself branding-wise as television for women and began a very coherent strategy of developing programming, targeting, so women are a big sector. So if we want to say what kind of women's programming, I think for the most part, what they were succeeding with was their movies. They were sort of melodramas. But they were centered on female characters.
In your book, We Now Disrupt This Broadcast, which was only published in 2018. So listeners, there are two really great important works if you are as fascinated about the idea of women-focused programming as I am, then We Now Disrupt This broadcast gets a little bit more into how it is that there was the growth of UPN and USA and TNT and the WB and how everything all sort of morphed together. And if you're like me, you remember, I remember Lifetime wanting to be everything in my life, that there was a very robust or perhaps state-of-the-art website. So the Lifetime website was was filled with mind candy and pictures, and it was supposed to be this resource. Do you, Amanda, have much in your memory or as you're teaching stuff about some of the approaches that these channels were taking to appeal to audiences, or the sweetest audience, which is at any given time, 18 to 35? Was that where these cable channels were shooting for?
Lifetime's audience tended to be a little bit older. So the web presence that I remember was the Oxygen Network, which when it launched, it was in kind of that heyday of the first wave of going on the internet and doing things. And it was designed and was trying very hard to be a place. It sort of acculturate its female audience to understand that web and television could work together, and that you could find more material from the thing that you were watching on the television if you went online. But those were pretty early days, I think, for a lot of the audience in terms of going online.
A part of that whole web presence resulted from, obviously, the internet and the fact that people were rapidly shifting from dial-up to some sort of DSL at the time it was called. Also at that time, however, the media conglomerates were conglomerating at a faster than ever pace, recognizing some of either they were creating channels by virtue of their conglomeration and their larger status, or they were buying up channels. Is that right? What was the field looking like then in those mid-90s when this became, it was very clear that this was going to make everybody a lot of money?
Well, there's sort of two waves. The first wave is the early 90s, which is, as you said, exactly the conglomeration. And so in that moment is when you have industries that were previously separate. In other words, you used to have film studios and broadcast television networks and cable channels owned by different entities. And not only those distribution outlets, but also their studios. And so there were a number of deals in the late 80s and early 1990s that created the companies that we have today, like Disney. At that point, it was Viacom, CBS, Fox, 21st Century Fox. I'm missing one. Turner, Time Warner's evolution there, right? Mm-hmm. So you have that mass buy-up. And so for the first time, instead of, and at that point, I would argue it starts to become somewhat off point to be arguing about broadcast versus cable, because at that point you have companies that own both. And so they're hedging their bets, as opposed to an idea that broadcast is locked in some kind of death match with cable. Then the second phase in the late 1990s is an era in which, as you said, internet is slowly penetrating. But the big change that happens in that era is what's called digital cable.
Bookmark this, listeners. In America, we went from 3 big channels to the slow emergence of cable. Cable opens up a bit, enters living rooms around the country, and large media companies begin forming to own parts of all of the segments, including the boost that came from the internet presence. And it was only from the internet, which then spawned an explosion of marketing and engagement opportunities. Bookmark, digital cable.
The original cable systems ran on analog technologies that had a pretty limited capacity. You could really only have about 30 channels. And so in the late 1990s, in response primarily to the emergence of satellite competition, the cable service providers, the Comcasts of the world, just upgraded their infrastructure so that they could provide a digital service which had much greater capacity and could have those hundreds and hundreds of channels that we've just, come to expect. And the response to that environment of hundreds and hundreds of channels for the content side of the industry, the people that make programs and the channels that distribute them, was to try to launch as many channels as possible. And so in 97, 98, there were, I think between those 2 years, there were something like 200 new channels launched. And a lot of that was coming from these new conglomerated companies that were trying to figure out ways to, sort of take any little piece of property within them and to build a whole channel around them.
200 channels, 24 hours a day. Okay, call it 18 hours of programming plus 6 hours daily of infomercials. Okay, so that's 18 hours times 365 days in a year. That gets us to 6,570 hours of programming. And that's just for a single channel. 6,500 times 200 gets you to 1.3 million hours of TV programming. That's the result of the explosion.
On the topic here, it's at that moment that, Lifetime decides to spin off and create the Lifetime Movie Network that will just have Lifetime movies. They're still the Lifetime mothership. And at one point, they also launched another one called Lifetime Real Women, which was, supposed to be the destination for unscripted and gender-focused reality programming. And so, that's just what Lifetime was doing. And so, and they are but a small cog in the giant Disney machine. So, that's where really those 200 channels came from in many cases were, just these, the exponential growth of existing players.
And then there was children's oriented programming. And so there was Nickelodeon. And then we think about Cartoon Network, which was created. I mean, they just brought in, they wanted to do all sorts of original programming. And for a few years of heyday at Cartoon Network, we have some incredible classic, fresh animation that we'll never see again. All right. So help us then understand how it is that we get from 30 channels to hundreds of channels. And my recollection, and we were always cable, we were never dish, was it just felt like every couple of years the cable company would tell you to come get a new modem, or they'd be sending somebody out to replace your modem, and you got a bigger cable box. I guess they weren't called modems at the time. They were still cable boxes because they weren't delivering us our internet yet. That was coming in through another way. So our, if you were just a consumer, you maybe didn't really notice it until you started to see that the numbers were getting higher and higher, and you had the SoapNet, and you had Hallmark Channel, and things that either were your happy walk down memory lane, or that was your opportunity to learn more things. And where would we be without What Not to Wear is my question. And that wasn't even women's programming from a women's network. That was from TLC. So how did something like, how did all that original programming, was that then these relatively new channels saying we've got to fill our time with something other than selling kitchen gadgets and infomercials?
Yeah, so the way that cable channels make money, they have two revenue streams. One is the advertising, and so you want to have programming that attracts people that you can then sell to advertisers. But the other way they make money is they get paid from the cable service provider, right? So Comcast wants to be able to say we have 300 channels, and so to get on Comcast service, Comcast pays each channel a per subscriber per month fee. Now, in many cases, it's less than 10 cents. But mind you, when you have millions of subscribers, those 10 cents add up. And so the cable business was recognizing that it wasn't only going to be about advertising, that actually about half of its revenue was likely to come from the service providers in this form of subscription money. And they recognized that the negotiation that they have with those cable services were a particularly important way to increase how much money they might make. And they recognized that in order to convince Comcast, let's say, to pay 11 cents per subscriber per month instead of 10, that they needed to offer something and they need to be able to say, hey, look, we've got this thing no one else has.
Now, if you're a loyal listener, you know that it is not often that we express love for a person. But listeners, don't you love Amanda Lutz? She thinks about this stuff. She knows it cold and she explains it. Because yes, it's important. We don't get to the power monopolies of #MeToo and Time's Up without understanding the flow of money that took place when cable exploded. But remember, 1 million hours of new programming was great for the viewer, but it was hard work for the folks whose job it was to define and brand and position a new channel to be the new favorite on our remotes.
And they were also concerned that as, these bazillion channels came out, that it would be more and more difficult to get on the systems. And so in order to get on the systems, they wanted to make sure they had some sort of value proposition that, consumers would miss if they were to go away. And so that explains a lot of the push to original programming. There was a financial reason for it. And then the other reason was just, in an environment of 300 channels, it's really difficult to stand out. And so this was really the high era of cable branding and the need to, be a destination where people knew what to expect, right? It got to the point you can't keep track of what's on 20, 30 different channels that you might watch and when it's on. And so if you sit down to watch, you flip to the channel where you kind of know what you can expect. You know what you're going to get at Lifetime. You know roughly what you're going to get at TLC, right? And so that was the other reason for some of the programming development that you see in that era, which was the need to really clearly brand and identify channel identity.
And to that point, so there was the original programming, and then there were a handful of rerun, syndication of some of the vintage shows of the 60s and 70s and 80s that we discussed earlier that did find their way to keeping the flame alive, I guess, to some degree, to create new generations of fans of everybody from Patty Duke to Mary Tyler Moore and some of those classic shows.
What different cable channels choose to buy is a complicated story. I think perhaps the most relevant part to this conversation is really the challenge that Lifetime had in trying to find programming that was developed by the broadcast networks that did sort of, announce itself as television for women. And this was also a problem throughout the early 2000s when Spike tried to brand itself as a network for men. When you're still trying to buy programming that was designed for a broad audience, it's really difficult to cement that brand identity. And so that too was a reason that pushed the cable channels toward original programming. That was really the only way that they could make sure that the programming they were developing was matching their brand, as opposed to buying programming from the broadcast networks that already had a pretty clear identity, right? And so even though, to a degree, I'm sure the Law and Orders, became familiar on USA, they were also very clearly in the minds of many viewers NBC programs. And so it was difficult to overcome that identity. And so that wasn't helping USA build its brand at all.
There were some back, I guess I remember when you could still have a TV that didn't have to get hooked up to cable, and you would get all the major networks, and then you would get like 45. You would get these little outliers that you could actually still get through a regular TV. And that included like the WB and UPN. What happened there? And I'm asking this for all the fans of Girlfriends and Living Single and the sense that there were all these sitcoms that were coming up fresh. Many of them were featuring, an all African American cast or much a lot of emphasis on this sort of storytelling. What happened?
Yeah. So those you described well the notion of what were channels that were stations that were not affiliated, let's say in the 1980s. And in the late 80s, the story really begins with Fox, which was a thing that nobody thought was going to survive. There's 3 networks. There can only be 3 networks. But Fox comes on the scene in 86 and makes affiliation agreements with many of those independent stations that were out there. And Fox actually starts by trying to build a network that serves audiences that really aren't being served particularly well by the big 3 networks that are trying to have the biggest tent possible. And that means that they're really going after the mass audience, which in the U.S. is white and of decent age. And so Fox initially goes after a youth audience with programs like 21 Jump Street and 90210 and The Simpsons, and then steadily develops a slate of African-American targeted programming that's featuring African-American casts when you're seeing very few people of color on the main broadcast networks. And that strategy works really well. And that, along with football, really cements Fox's ability to survive.
Listeners, you love TV. You know some of your favorite shows came from this era. Many stars and writers got their starts, almost 15, 16, 17 years ago, 20 years ago. You want to think more about these groundbreaking shows? Well, tune in to episode 4. While we won't cover all of them, we will for sure discuss some of the milestones and the pioneers and trendsetters.
And then you see Fox move to try to expand its audience and really starts taking on the programming strategies of NBC, CBS, and ABC. And here we are at that point about a decade later in the mid to late 1990s. And at that point, the WB and UPN launch as doing exactly the same thing, pulling together a bunch of independent stations to make a network and trying a new programming, trying to, again, sort of segment the audience a little more specifically. As you say, at the WB, you have both a heavy load of white teen drama and African-American cast sitcoms. And so, what happened generally is that those 2 networks, UPN and the WB, merged and became what we now know as the CW. And I think everybody's programming strategies, let's say by 2000, start to change as the big 3 just aren't that big anymore. And that everyone is still watching a lot of television. The amount of television viewed doesn't decrease, but that television viewing is just really spread out. And it's at that point that we begin to see television moving steadily toward being much more of a niche service rather than a mass service. In the realm of cable, you have channels that are better able to do that because they are getting that subscriber funding as well as advertising. Because part of what that shift from mass to niche means is that fewer people are watching.
There is so much to talk about. Television for women, which of course begets a better understanding of Lifetime. But then there's the Hallmark Channel, OWN, the Oprah Winfrey Network, We, and Oxygen. Oxygen is a total player even today, as Dr. Lotz described. It's now owned by NBC Universal, but it was founded by Oprah Winfrey and big-name showrunners Casey Mondebach and Marcy Carsey and others. These women had experience producing some of our most popular broadcast shows, and they took all that talent and all that passion for women's programming to cable. Oxygen's emphasis these days is on murders and crime. I don't get it. And then there are reality shows on networks beyond the ones that I've listed that target, quote, women's interests. And I say air quotes there on women's, because with 1 million hours of programming time out there, cable has fulfilled a tiny aspect of its mission to educate us and expand our knowledge. But I used air quotes because really, who's to say what's television for women anymore? Is Storage Wars a guy's show? A woman's show? How about any of the other DIY house renovation, a bathroom redo, the real estate shows about flipping? or about buying, even whether or not you should go ahead and invest in a renovation. I feel like all of those shows are neither. Reality and unscripted TV plays to some stereotypes and breaks so many others into pieces. There is social change in reality shows. If you're a cable subscriber, put down your phone and take a walk through your guide. Do you even think about whether your favorite channels offer quote-unquote television for women? Apart from the sports channels that offer a preponderance of men's sports only, is there really representation? And how hard is it to find women on TV? Whether that's out of reality shows or old movies or even talk shows or sports. And is there room in the lineup for a new entry, like Start TV? While you're in your remote's guide function, find Start TV and see that it's offering up some of those very series from the early 2000s that were fresh and women-centric, like Family Law, Crossing Jordan, The Closer, Strong Medicine, The Profiler, Cold Case. Some were cable originals, some aired first on broadcast, but all have found a new home on Start TV. Finally, I'll ask this question of you, listeners, and encourage you to head to tvherstory.com and jot us a note. Here's what I want you to think about. To Dr. Lotz's point, in this very large field, and in your very busy day, and in all the different ways that you can now access programming, your favorite shows, does Start TV's niche resonate with enough viewers, women and men, it doesn't matter, to keep these lesser seen shows alive? And if you can't answer that because it's not what you think about, go ahead and send me what your favorite shows are that you're currently watching, however it is you watch it. So the show itself and how you watch it. Because I'm curious, whether it's broadcast, cable, streaming, YouTube, what are you watching and why? It has been a great, fun chat. I feel like we were just sitting in the student union having coffee, talking about all of this important stuff that makes TV Herstory, puts it into context, helps us understand why we're watching what we are today and how we're watching what we see today. Amanda Lutz, you are a very busy person. You are a prolific writer and lecturer, and you're a podcaster. So tell us a little bit more about your podcast and how people can listen to it.
The podcast is Media Business Matters. You can find episodes on my website, which is amandalutz.com, under podcast. It's also on Apple's iTunes library and in Google Play. And it is really, I think, was an effort to provide something else in the space. There's a lot, if you follow media business news, there's sort of a lot of constant breathless reporting about every new announcement, who is cast in this, who might buy that. And we just ignore that and instead look at things that actually have happened or are happening and focus on why they matter. And so it does make the episodes much more evergreen than if they were just quick news digests. And so I think they actually stand up pretty well. And in recent months, we've also been doing more interviews with people who work in different sectors of media industries that might not, get as much attention. And so we did a series most recently on local news, which was really fun, and we learned a ton. And we've also looked at podcasting and public media, so they're all out there.
Thanks to noted television scholars and authors Amanda Lutz and Emily Newman for contributing to my understanding of this corner of the industry and for taking time out of their schedules to sit for our interviews. Find the works of and information about both of these fine women in the show notes as well as in the season description on our website, which is tvherstory.com. Do you like what you hear? Support us today on Patreon. That's right. It's an online tip jar that you can access from our podcast's homepage. So go to tvherstory.com, scroll down past the episode player where you'll see a box that reads, Become a Patron, and follow the directions. Because just like public radio, we have basic infrastructure costs here at Advanced TV Herstory. We bring you no advertising. And just like public radio, your pocket change each month can make a big difference. That difference comes in the form of the very talented Jen Eads our audio technician, and Catherine Yang, our video and social media platform director. The three of us love to bring you this great content and hope you find it valuable and innovative and worth your time. Music found through all our episodes is called Take Me Higher. It's by Jazzer, found at Free Music Archive. And yes, indeed, we've sent him some money into his virtual tip jar. Find our Twitter and Instagram handles at our website, and there's a place at the site for you to send us a message. And of course, if your podcast app gives you the chance to write a quick review about Advanced TV Herstory, well, know that we'd be deeply humbled for a minute of your time. You listeners, bringing you the stories and understanding about how, who, and what we see on TV, that's why I podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.